First of all, I'd like to thank the Glazer family again for this opportunity to study together and to attempt to teach Americans to speak English correctly. Also like to thank everyone else who made it possible, and of course Or Sameach itself for all the work that I am privileged to be part of. The idea of Rosh Hashanah and beginning a year anew gives us an opportunity to look at the main tool that we have to make the changes that we need to make, and that's free will. It's axiomatic in Jewish thinking that the purpose of being human, in fact the identity of a human being, is a capacity to act freely. So let's take a look at that subject and see if we can gain some clarity this evening on the concept of free will and what it means. You know, in modern psychology, the teaching is that we should escape conflict. Live a peaceful, serene life, not in conflict. But the idea of free will really means that we live in conflict. In fact, the meaning of being a human being is that you live in a zone of conflict. According to our deep sources, the reason that we have free will is because we are high enough to feel the pull of the moral and the conscience-driven aspect of reality, but we're low enough to feel the animal pull as well. So we live in that zone where we pulled in two directions. Creatures lower than us don't have free will. Animals, they're too low. They're not sensitive to a moral option. And creatures above us, angels, malachim, don't have free will because they're too high. That means they see too clearly. Technically speaking, angels have free will. But the reason they don't make mistakes is because when you see the consequence of an action clearly enough, you don't do it wrong. For example, do you have free will to walk into a fire? What would you say? Well, I say technically you're free, but in practice, no. Do you have free will to jump off a tall building? Yeah, technically, yeah, but you see yourself becoming part of the scenery so clearly that you wouldn't do it. When you see the consequence of an action clearly, it takes away your freedom. If you felt someone's pain when you hurt their feelings, if you really felt what they were going through, you wouldn't do it again. The only reason you're able to make mistakes in the world, you don't hurt someone's feelings, because you think to yourself, well, they won't really feel it, and you know what they did to me, and actually they deserve it, and by the time you finish, it's a big mitzvah, you know. So, but if you really saw what you were doing, you experienced it clearly, you wouldn't do it again. And therefore, amazingly, we have freedom of will only because we pitched exactly at that zone of confusion, where we feel the pull of the sensual, the lecherous, the animal, the earthy, the childish, and we also feel a different pull. There's a medrash that puts this very beautifully. Medrash says that when Hashem created the human being, so it says, Na'aseh Adam. Na'aseh Adam, let us make man. What's problematic with that statement? Who's us? If there's one thing that Torah stands on, it's Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. So who's the us? And the Medrash goes into many aspects of this, but one that's relevant to tonight is this. The Medrash says that when Hashem created the human being, He consulted His midas. That means He consulted the characteristics that He planned to put into man. He asked charity, tzedakah, He asked truth, He asked justice, consulted the midas. And some said yes, and some said no. MS, truth said, don't create man, he'll be full of lies. Tzedakah said, create man, he'll give tzedakah. And while they had a tremendous argument, some of them saying, he shall be created, and some saying he should not be created, while they were locked in an almighty conflict, Hashem created man. That's what happened. So the unsophisticated way to hear that medrash is that Hashem ignored them. He asked for their advice, and He ignored them. That means they couldn't resolve the issue, so He bypassed them. But the sophisticated way to understand that medrash is, He asked for their advice and He took it. He created man a conflict of midas. So that's the meaning. The meaning is that Hashem said, shall man be created? And of course that's Rosh Hashanah. Some said, he shall be created, and some said, he should not be created. And that's what happens every Rosh Hashanah really. That argument, that war between the human beings' midas. Some saying you shall be created, and some say you shall not. And that's what's in the balance in Rosh Hashanah. Which means that what it is to be created as a human, and what it is to exist on a Rosh Hashanah really means to fight that battle. Right? In fact, very beautiful, sensitive hearing of the Medrash. Na'aseh Adam. One interpretation is let us make man. Another interpretation is man's already been made. Na'aseh is been made. In other words, bypassing, not yet, using that conflict in order to create a human being. And so we are creatures of conflict. So let's study this evening some of the theme of this conflict and see if we can learn some of its parameters and some of its tools. First of all, I would say that free will is limited. Our free will exists only, if you look at your life, I would say horizontally and vertically, just to give it a graphic image, I would say. If you look horizontally, that means look at all the areas of your life. Your financial status, and your health status, and your social interactions, and your marriage. It's axiomatic in Torah thinking that we have freedom in only one of those zones. Where do you think that is? Why am I doing all the thinking? Finance, for example. Freedom of will there? Our teaching is very clear that we have freedom of will only in one zone, and that's the moral zone. Only in the area of ethical conflict. In other words, where the higher self is locked in battle with the lower self. What we call Yetzer Tov, Yetzer Ra. Where you have a conflict pulling you up towards the more angelic and the more refined, and an earthy animal pulled towards the lower. That's where you have freedom of will. Think about it for a moment. Take finance, for example. So you know as well as I do that on Rosh Hashanah every year is predetermined how much money you'll make in the year. At least the ceiling. That means nothing you can do will earn you 1 cent more than what's predetermined on Rosh Hashanah. First of all, I don't think you need me to tell you that. You can see yourself. Look around the world, you'll see there are people who are very smart, very well educated, very well trained, to make all the right business decisions and never make any money. And there are other people who are complete idiots and very rich. I happen to know a few in that category. The two are not connected. Right? You know, I saw an interview with Mr. Bronfman. Bronfman is a Jew in Canada, owns one half of Canada. There's another Jew owns the other half. But so Mr. Bronfman, they said to him, "Sir, how did you become so wealthy?" So Mr. Bronfman said, "When I was 10 years old, I bought an apple for 1 cent, and I sold it for 2 cents. Then I bought 2 apples and I sold them for 4 cents. Then I bought a box of apples and sold them for $1. Then my grandfather died and left me $61 million, and that's how I became." I would say that he has it right. He has it clear. That's the Jewish view. You make your effort, but the money comes from someplace else. So our concept is that money really, of course you can harm yourself financially. That you can certainly do. But that's an immoral thing to do. It's an avera. You have a responsibility for your possessions. And therefore you can damage. There's no limit how much you can damage yourself. But no matter what you do, you cannot guarantee earnings or income beyond a certain ceiling. They're not amenable to free will, and that's why we don't spend our lives with that as the focus. Take health, for example. You don't need to be a doctor to know that you can make all the right health moves and become ill. Not in your control. You can harm your health, of course, but that's an immoral thing to do. You have a special mitzvah not to do that. Take care of yourself. So there's no question you could damage your health to any extreme. But you can't guarantee good health because they're not amenable to your free will. And when you think about it, you know, marriage, for example. Certain limits in marriage. A young man, for example, cannot explore a relationship with every woman on earth, even though many young men seem to try. But, you know, you can't do that. Who's presented to you as a marriage option beyond your control? So in all of these areas, really, our teaching is that that is not where the prime application of freedom of will is. It's how you handle those areas that is where free will applies. And therefore, it's in the battle between the higher self and the lower self. That's the zone that needs focus. So when you approach a new year, really, it doesn't make any sense to fight on a battleground where no battles to be fought. This is where the battle is to be fought. It's the inner battle of how all the areas in life are handled using that tool. That, I would say, is the focus. That's the area where Bechira free will applies. But there's something much more famous than this and much more critical. And that is that on a vertical scale, I would say, we have freedom of will. And this is a classic idea of Dessler, is the one who popularized this. But I would say this is a major key. There's without any question, this is the most famous idea in this whole area. And arguably the most famous idea in all of Jewish, call it machshava, ashkafa, whatever word you want to use. That is called nekudas habechira, nekudat habechira, the point of freedom of will. So let's focus on this for a few minutes this evening and see if we can understand. Nothing more important than this. Imagine a vertical scale. So on that vertical scale, each person is pitched at a particular point, and it's at that point that you have freedom of will. Imagine you have here a vertical scale. Down there someplace, is a person who has a very low level of bechira. A person who spends his days on the street mugging little old ladies violently, let's say. What's his level of freedom of will? So Rav Dessler says the next time he mugs a little old lady, if he decides not to kill her, but only to crack her skull, he has a tremendous moral advance. And he'll be rewarded spiritually for that. To you that may sound ridiculous. I mean, I don't know you all personally, but I presume that most days you're not hanging out on the street mugging little old ladies. I mean, at least not if you're here on a Wednesday night listening to a Torah shir. And that's not your credit. That's not your situation. But it is his situation. And therefore, when he expresses himself at that level, that's where he's expressing his freedom of will. And that's where the reality is for him. In other words, each of us is pitched at a particular point, and below that point, things are easy for you. There's no meaningful battle below you. And therefore, of course, you pass those tests, but there's very little credit in that. Beyond you, above you, are things that are too difficult for you, too refined. The challenge is too great. And it's true that you usually fail those tests, but they're not much spiritual damage. At least not damage of the free will exercise. Of course, there may be tremendous damage due to the Aveira itself. I'm not talking about that this evening. But in terms of the free will battle, things that are beneath you are easy to conquer. They're beneath your level. Things above you are hard to conquer. They're above your level. Where you're being tested is at your level of freedom. You know, we're very blind to this. It's really an obvious thing. But, for example, how do we compare ourselves to other people? We always compare ourselves in a way that's favorable. For example, we like to look at people who are financially better off than us and envy them, and look at people who are morally inferior to us and feel superior to them. But that's wrong. You should always look at people who are inferior to you financially and feel blessed, and look at people who are more spiritually advanced than you and feel envious of them. But it doesn't suit you to make that comparison. But that's the way a morally or spiritually sophisticated or advanced person, that's the way he thinks. In other words, your standard of comparison is where you hold it. To think that you're accomplished because things that are beneath you, you don't get wrong, is ridiculous. That's not where you're being tested. So far, so good? You know, you're Americans, you're supposed to be responsive. You know, I've been living in England for 10 years. There you have no idea if they're alive. But that's the idea. That's called Nekudas HaBechira. In other words, you're being challenged at a particular point, and that's where the battle is. What does this mean? It has tremendous practical application. I mean, for example, this is the reason that we don't compare children to each other. You know, in a Torah school, grades are not read out in a classroom. Because when a teacher reads out the grades in a classroom, she makes one student feel like a failure because another student got a better grade. But that's not education. Perhaps the other child is more gifted. Grades are important for the teacher to say to the child, for you that wasn't good enough. But there's no sense comparing one child to another. Right? Of course, when children are older, when they're 15, 16, 17, then the teacher can be ruthlessly unfair. Because life's unfair, they have to learn. But not when they're 7 years old and don't know that. I don't know if this happens in the United States, but where I was brought up in other countries, they often have at a junior school a prize giving. Do they do that? They give certificates and prizes? If you feel like being depressed for a week, go to one of those things. You know what happens? There's a sea of expectant little 7-year-old faces, and they start giving out the prizes. There's always one problematic child, obnoxious kid who probably had his brain irradiated when he was a fetus, who gets all the prizes. You know that kind of situation. This kid gets all the prizes, and sitting next to him is a little 7-year-old whose heart is breaking. Because he'd give anything to come home with a prize. He's not going to get one. That's not education, that's assassination. They all got to get prizes. And the place we learn this from, the Gemara says that in the next world, and I'll pick Kabbalah also, we know that from one particular perspective in the next world, each of us is judged alone. According to the Sfarim that talk about this, they say that in Olam Haba, each of us is compared only to what we could have been. That means you're not shown anyone else. Actually, it's not strictly speaking true that you're alone, because the same sources say that husband and wife are bonded into each other for all of eternity. Yeah? I mean, it's good news for some of us, a little distressing for others. But be that as it may, and that's because husband and wife are one fused entity. But what you see in that world is what you could have been. In other words, the standard of comparison is what you should have been. You're not compared to somebody else. You don't have his problems. And therefore, that is our sense of comparison and standard of judgment, is where you are holding. Another example, practical application. Rosh Hashanah is coming up. All of you sitting here tonight are going to be judged for stealing. Hashem's going to look at each one of you, each one of us, And he's gonna. So you're thinking to yourself, gee, what does he mean? I don't break into people's houses at night with a black mask and a crowbar. Well, I don't mean that. I mean at your level. For example, how many people sitting here this evening are employed by someone else? Okay, if you're employed by someone, and while you're working, you make a private phone call. 2 counts of stealing against you in halacha. One is your employer pays for the call. And secondly, you spend 10 minutes on the phone. You've been paid a salary to work. So if you live in a place where it's tacitly accepted that an employee can occasionally make a call, that's fine. How about long distance? How about 20 minutes on the phone? How about coming a little late to work, leaving a little early? How about not working as hard as you could? So what do you mean you don't steal? You mean you don't mug people on the street, but no one's looking at you in that context. Let's say you would never do that. If you wake someone who's sleeping, you're a little noisy, you wake your wife or your roommate. Problematic. Waking someone sleeping is getter of stealing. Let's say you'd never do that. You know that in halacha, if you don't greet someone correctly, you're considered to have stolen. A greeting, and it has to be done correctly, a greeting has 3 requirements. V'sever panim yafos. That means sever means you have to look at the person. Yeah, sever means look at them intelligently. Panim means you have to look at them. Yafos means you have to smile. So if you don't greet someone correctly, you've withheld something, and that's in the category of stealing. Let's say you would never get that wrong. There's a higher madrega. You see, we're not down there anymore. We've moved up. There's a level called gnevas das. You know what gnevas das is? When you mislead someone in a way that is not at all harmful, but is dishonest. According to many opinions, it's a Torah transgression. You're sitting down to dinner, you have an expensive bottle of wine. You're about to open the wine with your dinner. Unexpectedly, a friend of yours walks in. So you say to your friend, you know what? I'm going to open this wine in your honor. Lying through your teeth. Now, you didn't do any harm, but it's, according to some opinions, it's Issa D'Oraisa. That means you've stolen his mind. This is way above the person mugging people on the street, but it's where you're being judged. And if you're holding at that level, it could be that the judgment there is more severe than his. When you finally fight in the heavyweight division, if you win, here's $1 million, but if you lose it, break your jaw. There's further to fall. You know, if you visit someone in hospital, and on your way out, you notice someone else that you didn't know was there. So you walk into that person and you say, I came specially to visit you. Issa D'Oraisa, according to many opinions. That's called gnevas das. If he says to you, thanks for coming specially, you don't have to tell him that's wrong. That's brought in halacha. You don't have to upset him like that. But you can't let him believe. You can't lead him to believe that you came to visit him specially. That's gnevas das. Would you like a homework? Am I allowed to give homework, Nelly? Yeah? Here's a homework exercise. This was asked of one of the post-scheme in Israel some time ago. Here's something to think about. See if you can solve this halachic problem. Some time ago, a man walked into a bank in New York City here, and he asked the manager if he could take out a bank loan. So the manager said, yeah, we do loans. How much do you want? The fellow said $200. So I'm going overseas for 3 months. Manager said, are you serious? Such a small loan, you're going to pay 20%? He said, you advertise loans. Manager pulled out the forms, how to do it, start filling out the forms. When they got to the line that states collateral, the manager said to him, what are you going to leave us as security? The guy said, look, my car's in your parking lot, here are the keys, I don't need the vehicle, I'm going abroad, impound the vehicle, and when I come back, if I fail to pay the loan, so you will sell the car, it's worth more than $200. Manager said, fine. Guy went abroad, came back 2 months later, 3 months later, walked into the manager's office, paid $240, and left. Manager called him back and said, what was all that about? Guy said, where else could I get parking for $40 for 3 months? Zach Neves does? Well, that's an interesting question. On the one hand, total misrepresentation, complete dishonesty. On the other hand, he took a loan, he paid interest, he left value. But that's a question in Gnevas Das at a sophisticated level. That's a question here. If you told the fellow down there, he wouldn't see the problem. He'd be lost in admiration. He'd think that's too marvelous. In other words, there's questions are relevant at your level of refinement. And above that, people working on more serious things. People serious about their spiritual development work on every word. What's the Torah standard? Every word you ever say should be completely true, completely kind, and completely necessary. Anyone sitting here tonight who can say that every word they ever say is completely true, completely kind, and completely necessary? The people focusing on that. So the higher you move in terms of Nekudas HaBechira, the more severely you're being tested there. And it's ridiculous to compare yourself to someone lower on the scope. Anyone here play tennis? Tennis? Tennis is meaningful only against someone on your level. If you play someone much weaker than you, it's not called tennis. Right? Imagine you're a club player. Right? So you can play the best people in your club. One day you walk out onto the court, you find you've been challenged by a 3-year-old. Kid walks out with his diaper and his racket, now he's going to play you. So imagine you win. Is that called tennis? No. Yeah, your name goes up on the thing, but it's... On the other hand, let's say you play the world champion. And during the entire match, you never see the ball once. Would you go home and tell your mother you lost? No, you didn't lose. You didn't play. That's not tennis. A challenge is only meaningful when there's a balance of forces. When you play somebody more or less on your level, that's called a challenge. When you beat someone beneath you, it's easy, but there's no accomplishment there and there's no development. When you lose to someone much better, that's not called losing. Now, you're not operating at that level. Now, here's the interesting question. What accounts for your level? That means, why is the fellow down there, and you here, and someone else is there? And the answer to that question is, it may not be your fault. Fascinating subject, this, and very scary. But, you know, a little time to talk about scary things, maybe. It may not be your fault. For example, a person brought up with certain advantages or disadvantages is brought up at a certain level. The fact that he's at that level may not be his fault. He's tested at his level. But who takes accountability for what his level is? Perhaps his parents do. Or his grandparents. Scary thought, this. It means, let's say a child's brought up in an observant home. Child eats kosher food. Every morning when that child eats a kosher breakfast, he gets no reward for that. Just doing it out of habit. Who gets reward? Some grandparent who sacrificed mightily to bring up a family with those values, whether that grandparent's alive or not. Which means when you bring up your children at a certain level, and the children move on at that level, this could go on for generations, and you take the rap. You know, in some Sfarim, some sources ask the following question. You know, it says in Rosh Hashanah, so the books of the living and the dead are opened. The books of the living and the dead. Hashem judges all neshamas. So in the deeper sources, the question is, why would he judge the neshamas of people who are not alive? After all, being in the world means you can make a difference, you can use your bechira, you can develop. But a person leaves the world, you only coast with the momentum that's built up here. So imagine a lifetime. Person lives, at this point they die. Next year Hashem judges the neshama again. Next year, why? By definition, they can be no different here than they were the year before. You hear the question? What? Yeah, no? Anyone? Why would Hashem rejudge the neshama every year? That's not in the world. Can't be any different than it was the year before. The answer is very amazing. There's more than one answer here, but this answer is amazing. The answer is this. The reason the neshama gets judged here differently than a year before is because during this year, many things have happened in the world that are the results of something they did back here when they were alive. And it's only now playing itself out. Imagine 500 years ago, somebody had a child and died. And the child had children, and the children had children. And now there's 3,768 great-great-grandchildren in the world. To some extent, everything that all of them are doing accrues to the credit of the person who began the process. Isn't that scary? Yeah, you're Americans, nothing scares you, right? Scary stuff, yeah. Here's a man talking to his friend on the telephone. His 4-year-old son's playing under the table. Man says to his friend, well, it's not really accurate, but it's okay. Little boy hears his father say you can take liberties with the truth, and grows up with a slightly warped sense of the value of the truth. And on that distortion, he founds all his friendships and his marriage and all his business activities. And for all of those distortions, the father takes the rap, because that's where the distortion occurred. Many applications. You know, you heard from Rabbi Rockmel about Rosh Hashanah Yeshiva. You know, one of the ironies we have I come from South Africa. There you have, one of the ironies you have is that many young people have changed their lives radically. It's probably the only place on earth where a whole community has radically changed itself. And sometimes in that community, yeah, you find it other places as well, you find a young person whose parents were, many of my parents' generation in South Africa were very Jewishly positive, but they weren't knowledgeable technically. They weren't brought up with Torah and mitzvahs formally, but they were brought up with that old Lithuanian sense of values and midas. And many of my generation, because of that, were given a Jewish education. Very often what happens is a youngster becomes fully observant and they go to yeshiva and they start studying. Sometimes they come to look down on their parents. After all, he's a bet Torah, he knows how to learn, his parents don't know. He looks down on them. But the irony of the situation is very often the reason that he developed like that is because of his parents. Because although they weren't knowledgeable B'nai Torah, they sacrificed enormously to give their child a Jewish education. They taught him to be a seeker for the truth, to be intellectually honest. I'm not so sure who gets the credit. You have to have the perception to see where the real point of origin is. And sometimes you see actions where very clearly an action has tremendous consequences and you have to see where the point of origin. You know, once I met a man in South Africa who was a Hasidic Jew from Brooklyn who came to buy diamonds in South Africa. I'm telling you a first-hand story. This is not hearsay. This man, his mother was pregnant in the Warsaw Ghetto just before the Germans killed everyone, and she needed to see a doctor. So she managed to sneak out of the ghetto and she went to see a lady, gynecologist, a Christian woman, Catholic lady from the old Polish aristocracy. And she treated this Jewish woman. When she finished treating her, and this Jewish woman was about to go back, she said to her, if you go back into the ghetto, do you know what's going to happen to you? So the lady said, yeah, I know. So she said, look, come and stay with me. So the woman said, I can't leave my husband. So she said, bring him too. So she said, I can't leave my family. So she said, bring him as well. So the woman went back into the ghetto and told her husband that this Christian woman was offering to save their lives. So the husband said, I can't leave my family. So they took him as well. And they arrived at this Catholic lady's house with 13 people. She put them in her attic for 22 months, including a time during which the Gestapo occupied the house. And for 22 months she fed them and kept them clean. There was no bathroom. There was no facilities. Completely bare attic. With her own hands, every day under the nose of the Germans, she fed them and took care of them, kept them clean. All 13 survived. And after 22 months she managed to get them across the border, and all 13 ended up in New York City. About 10 years ago in New York, there was a wedding of one of the grandchildren of one of those 13 people. And at that wedding, there were 200 people present, descended from the 13 people that she had saved 65 years before. And they went to Poland and they found her and they brought her to be present. Old lady, to be present at a Jewish wedding in New York, to see 200 people dancing around her that are the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of 13 people that she saved. And during the meal, someone went up to her and they said to her, why did you risk your life to save Jews? And she drew herself up to a full, frail height and she said, because I read the Bible. And in Genesis, I saw that when Sodom was about to be destroyed, Abraham negotiated with God. And he said, if you could find 50 righteous people there, will you save the city? And God said yes. 45 righteous people, and God said yes. And she said, and I hope there were enough of us to save Poland. And I was wrong. Okay, now that's something to envy. Because those are all her children. And their children are her children too. You know, in Connecticut 2 years ago, I mentioned this story, and a fellow got up at the back and he said, I was at that chasana, I'm a grandchild. So you do an action in the world and it ripples on and on and on to the extent that it continues with your momentum, it's yours. Of course, with the grandchild ups and changes his dispensation, then it's his. But he can't take credit for the starting point. And one of the major messages here is, don't tell me you have disadvantages in life. Who cares? So instead of starting here, you started there. So it's not your fault. Somebody's going to take the rap for that. But you being what do you do there? That's your question. Hashem's not judging you for where you begin. He's judging someone else for that. Maybe he's responsible directly. Your grandparents, great-grandparents, I don't know, United States government, Social Security. But what you're being held accountable for is what have you done at your point of Bechir. And conversely, if you're born tremendous advantages and you're very high because you're brought up with superb education, doesn't count for anything. Because you have to lift that point to gain credit. And that is the teaching, that's the basic idea of Nekudas HaBechira. A very, very famous concept, tremendous key to many Torah subjects. Yiras HaDoros, how the generations go down and how they're judged. It's a major principle that Torah cannot be understood without understanding this standard of comparison. And of course the point changes. Rav Dessler makes that very plain. When you operate at a certain point, when you lift your Bechira, you get judged at a new point. Imagine a young man goes out for lunch. He's about to cross the street into the local seafood deli. You know, shrimp, crab, lobster boiled alive, bacon sauce, you know. Not good. But he likes it. And next door is a kosher deli. Doesn't like good food. But for some reason he stands there thinking about it and he says to himself, Jewish kid, unkosher food desensitizes you. Stands there shaking and sweating for half an hour, finally chooses a kosher lunch. Ooh, tremendous development. Tremendous growth. Because a value has overcome a sensual drive. But the next day the battle doesn't last as long. And after a few days he's eating kosher food out of habit, no more reward. Of course he has the benefit of what he's doing. But since there's no more battle anymore, he's outgrown yesterday's battle. So this new level of Bechira, there are two questions we ask here. One is, how is it that a person, you see, when a person raises his level of Bechira, Hashem sends him a new ordeal at the new level. And the two questions are how and why. Why is easy to answer, because otherwise you'd outgrow Bechira. When you beat the guys in the club, in your tennis club, you have to play the national people. When you can beat the national people, you have to play the international circuit. Because as you build muscle, when you pick up weights in the gym, you build muscle. When you build muscle, you have to pick up bigger weights. Yesterday's weights are trivial. And that's how it works. So as you strengthen yourself spiritually, and the deep question of how is because there are not two beings inside. Yetzer Tov, Yetzer Hara are not two beings. There's only one person inside. Yetzer means how you yotzer, how you form that inner being. In deep sources is written that there's nothing in the world good or bad, only more powerful or less powerful. Nothing good or bad. Money. Money's not good or bad. More money is more power. With more power you can do more good or more bad. Character. Let's say a person has a very charismatic, persuasive personality. It's not good or bad. Depends what he does with it. Take electric power in these. Yeah. So this is America. It's a wimpish 110 volts. Not like where real men live. But, how much can you do with 110 volts or two? So you can power some appliances, but if you put your fingers in, it's unpleasant. Unpleasant. You probably won't die. It's unpleasant. But if you're working on the high tension lines, it's 11,000 volts. There's enough power in those lines to power a city. But if you touch one of those, you'll be fried. And therefore what happens is, as you lift yourself, become a bigger person, you don't fall out of balance of Bechira, but you have new ordeals to deal with. They might be more refined, but they're more difficult, but you're more capable. And that's how the point of Bechira shifts. So far so good? Yeah, very enthusiastic response, huh? Okay, let's take the next step. This has tremendous explanatory power, which flies in the face of the world we live in. We live in a world, if you read today in criminology or sociology, psychology, the teaching is we don't really have free will. We are victims of our instincts and our chemistry and our genes, and it leads to tremendous errors. Let me share with you an insight into how powerful this concept of Nekudas HaBechira is, and how much clarity it gives on many human situations. Just stay with me. I'll give you two examples. I have a friend who's a psychiatrist. So one day he came to me and he said he wants to discuss with me one of his patients. Why? I'm not a psychiatrist. Here's his problem. He has a 21-year-old Jewish girl that he's treating. She has a tremendous compulsion to steal candy in the supermarket. Tremendous compulsion. She's fine in all other areas. She's a wealthy girl. She can afford as much candy she wants. She's got a home full of candy. She has a compulsion. It's a well-known psychoneurotic problem. And she's undergoing therapy. What's the problem? She's now in court for the 10th time. And the judge is asking my friend to testify about her sanity. As her doctor, if he tells the judge that she's mentally insane, that means psychotically detached from reality, she will go for psychiatric treatment. If he tells the judge that she's sane, she'll go to jail. And she'd probably die there. You're talking about a sweet, sensitive girl in a South African jail. Not good. And my friend finds himself unable to tell the judge that she's insane. She's not insane. To meet the definition of legal insanity, you have to be out of touch with reality. She certainly knows what she's doing. She usually controls herself. She's going for therapy. Think about that carefully. How do you approach that situation? If you say the girl's got kleptomania and therefore she's not responsible, then who's responsible for anything? I will claim that anything I did is simply the result of my compulsions. She has a more florid and more blatant version. And if you say, oh, she's fully accountable, that's got to be wrong too. The reason you don't hang out in the supermarket, I presume, most days, stealing candy, is because you don't have kleptomania. So how do you judge a person? Is this point clear? Yes? No? Let me give you another example. Maybe about 10 years ago, I think, A young girl was jogging through Central Park in New York City when 5 or 6 young men from Harlem attacked her. Do you remember this case? It was a famous case. They almost killed her, but they never stole anything. When the police picked them up, they told the police that they did it for fun. Okay, the case came to trial in New York, and it raised a national uproar. The reason is that the lawyers for the defense argued that these young men should be acquitted because they were brought up in Harlem. They were so beaten and abandoned and brutalized and poverty-stricken and uneducated with no role models that what they did was normal for their social group. In fact, technically what happened was the lawyers tried to invalidate the jury. They said, you middle-class whites cannot sit in judgment on these people because you can't relate to their situation. Now let's think about that for a moment. If you say these young men are not accountable because they were brought up in a desperately bad situation, well, who's accountable for anything? Then I can always claim that whatever I did is the result of all the inputs that formed me. But if you say, oh, they're 100% accountable, their ghetto background's irrelevant, that's got to be wrong. Right? The reason you don't hang out in the park most Sundays, beating girls to a pulp with a piece of lead piping, is because you weren't brought up in those circumstances. You'd be sick at the thought. Is the problem clear? Whichever way you go here, you're in trouble. If you say that people's actions are explained by all the inputs, biochemical, genetic, sociological, then you forget about justice. No one's responsible. And if you say that those things are irrelevant and people are responsible, you're ignoring obvious facts. Of course your background's relevant. Do we share the problem? The answer is so clear, and it's such a fundamental principle. And here's the answer. The answer is that all that modern psychology teaches you is quite correct. Of course your genes and your background and your sociological influences and your ghetto background, and of course it's relevant. You know what it does? It sets the point of freedom. If you're brought up in those circumstances, instead of having a point of freedom here, your point will be down there. That's not your fault. But what you do at your point of freedom is up to you. No? When those guys stand in the park and the girl jogs past and one guy says to the other one, hey dude, well whatever they say in, wouldn't it be cool to beat that girl up? And the other guy says, yeah man. That's not his fault. That is not his fault. That's how you think if you're brought up in those circumstances. But when they walk over and do it, bearing in mind that they wouldn't appreciate being beaten up, and they're guilty. Is this clear? In other words, where your point of freedom is pitched may not be your fault. That may in fact be the fault of the social influences and the chemistry and the genes, but you're only being judged at your point of freedom. Of course, we're talking where the point of freedom is between the red lines of possibility. Once a person is above or below the red line, there's no accountability, not spiritual and not legal. A child, for example, right? There's no bechira. A child, or a person who's sufficiently mentally abnormal. Or, says the Rambam, a person with a gun to his head. Rambam says if a person puts a gun to your head and says, kill him or I'll kill you, you're not allowed to kill the person. But if you do, says the Rambam, you're not accountable legally. Because too much pressure. We're not talking about that. You know, in England, a couple of years ago, 2 children killed a baby. You know about this case? 2 children, 10 and 11-year-old. The court had a very difficult time trying to decide whether they were accountable. How old do you have to be accountable for your actions if you're a non-Jew according to Torah? If you're a Jew, bar mitzvah, right? You have to be 12, 13, with some other considerations. But if you're non-Jewish, what's the halacha? What's the Torah responsible age for a non-Jew according to Torah? Any offers? When you're old enough. When you're old enough to know right from wrong. And it's a very difficult judgment call. Where the red line is may be very vague. The halacha is always like that. The halacha is always clear, black and white. But where it's to be applied, where you fall this side or that side, people misunderstand this. When people go to Gedolim in Torah, the reason you should be going to a Gadol is not to look up something in a book that you should be able to look up. It's for making a judgment call when it's not clear at all. But he's so imbued with Torah that he knows which way to go. And it can be difficult. A couple of years ago, a boy with Down syndrome walked into Rabbi Elyashiv's room. And he said, I've come to ask the rabbi to tell my father to let me have a bar mitzvah. My father says, I'm not normal and I can't read the Torah for the community and you can't have a bar mitzvah. And I want you to tell my father, I want to read like every other boy. So Rabbi Elyashiv said to the boy, how did you get here? He said, I took a 33 bus in Bnei Brak to the main bus station. I took a number 1 to Yerushalayim. And I took a 25 to come and see you. Rabbi Elyashiv said, tell your father that's good enough. Okay, you have to make it. I don't know if you would let the child be an aid in based in, but you have to know. That's a question of judgment. But once you're between the red lines, once there is the possibility of having chosen differently, so then there's Bechira. And that is the doctrine of Nekudas HaBechira. You've been judged at your point of freedom. And that's where you need to consider yourself. Yeah? Can we take one more step? You have some more patience? You're free to disagree, you know. Let's add one more detail. Up to here, I think everything is straightforward. No fancy footwork, right? You're being compared against your own capacity. It shifts as you develop. But there's a much more difficult issue. Let's spend a few minutes on that. But I'm warning you, from here it gets difficult, gets even mystical. So it needs concentration. Let's think deeply. Let's put the microscope on the point of freedom. In other words, why is a person's point of freedom where it's at? We know, because of his genes, his background, his socializing influences, all that happened to him. But why do you make the choices you make at your point of freedom? Is the question clear? Imagine, for example, a girl walks into the store, she sees the candy, right? Walks in, sees the candy, tremendous compulsion. Looks around, doesn't know that the CCTV is watching her. In the manager's office, he's watching the screen with his friend, the psychologist. Sooner or later, she takes the candy and walks out. And the manager says to his friend, why did she do that? Why did she choose that way? What's the answer? There's no answer to that question. The answer is, she chose. Any other answer you give is a denial of free will. She did it because when she was 3 years old, it's her father's fault? Or it's her mother's fault? The answer to that question is, that's where the buck stops. Or starts, if you like. You make a free will choice because you make the choice. That's where you're in control. The Western world finds this extremely difficult. In Western logic, everything has a prior cause. So you go back to the cause and the cause of the cause. A very difficult notion is something that's not caused by a prior cause. That's you. Everything else you can blame on someone else. But the cold, lonely moment of choice, that's up to you. You know, if I make a picture of it in certain deeper sources, you know that the human body is built on the pattern of the mind. You familiar with that? That means, from my flesh I see the higher world. And I would say that if you made a picture of the neshama, or the ruach, whatever it is, it would look like the body. And here, at this point of origin, is a place that's called Ratzon. Ratzon. The tool of Bechira is your will. Ratzon means will, volition. The word Ratzon in Hebrew has the same gematria as the word Makor, which means a source. Actually, Shmoy, Hashem's name, has the same value. A source is something that you cannot ask for a source for. Where does the river begin? It begins here. What's the cause of this flow of water? This point. This point, this point. But you can't ask for the source of the source. Don't make any sense. Is that clear? This place here, you know, where a baby's skull is open. When a newborn child, you can feel the brain pulsate. Here. Right? By the way, this is where tefillin are worn. Rashi says you wear your tefillin where this child's skull is open. What are tefillin? Tefillin is a connection to the higher world. Tefillin is, in Kabbalah's Sforim, is written that when Adam Harishon was created, he had tefillin growing out of his head. Right? That's called Bekias HaMoichin in Kabbalah. That's where the brain bursts out. Tefillin is a connection to a higher world, just like tefillah is your connection with Hashem. Tefillin. But this point of origin here, where you can feel the skull exposed, the brain you can feel, that's where things begin. When you make a decision, you make it with your point of origin. You can't ask for a cause. You are the cause of it. Children have to be taught this, because kids are brought up to believe that, not my fault. You know, it's always like that. Say, sir, how did you become so wealthy? Well, that's, ever since I was 14, I got up early and I worked long hours and I worked really hard. I did it. Then they find me doing something terribly immoral. Say, why'd you do that? It's not my fault. I was born that way. Exactly the opposite. The wealth, you worked hard and you were given a gift. Immoral, because you're a slob. That's why you failed. But that's the concept. The concept is this point of origin is a point of origin. You control it. And it's very paradoxical. For example, stay with me carefully. This point of origin means Rabbi Dessler puts it like this. He says, because Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, this point is a unitary point. That means you can only decide one thing at a time. You can't, when you're faced with an option, two options, you can go this way or that way. You can't go both ways at once. A decision is possible only in one direction, and when you make that choice, it's all that you are. And very weird things come out of this. Let me give you an example. Imagine you're facing an ordeal where one option attracts you very strongly, and one option attracts you very weakly. That means in one direction you have a very powerful temptation, and the other direction you have a very weak motivation. Which one will you choose? If you say the powerful one, you've just denied freedom of will. Here's a metal object and two magnets, one strong, one weak. The metal object moves towards a strong magnet. Here's a human being, two motivations, one strong, one weak. No, that's a denial of freedom of will. Amazingly, you have to say that I can find myself pulled in two different directions, in one direction very powerfully, in one direction very weakly, and I can choose to move in the direction of the weaker appeal. Isn't that weird? But it has to be that way. Can you see that? Anyone? Yes. Very weird. By the way, it's almost always the sensual animal is the strong one, and the conscience ethical is almost always the weak one. Rabbi Dessler explains that it's exactly the opposite of Adam Rishon. When Adam was formed, he was formed with only a yet. That means his powerful motivation, that means his first person sense of I, was only his neshama. His lecherous animal material self was a very distant creature called the Nachash, speaking to the second person you from the outside. But the essence of I, my experience of myself, was only good. Now we're the reverse. Rabbi Dessler puts it something like this. When you look at a human being now, you see only the body. Only the body. You see a person's neshama. If you look very carefully, especially on the face of somebody who's highly developed spiritually, you see a glow called ziv upon him, but very, very faint. Person dies 1 minute before death, gone 1 minute after, but it's very hard to see. Adam Rishon was exactly the opposite. When you looked at him, you only saw a neshama. If you looked very carefully, you could make out the wispy outline of a body. It was like looking at a 1,000-watt electric bulb. You could hardly see the glass. But after the sin, after he crashed himself into that opposite warring condition, he became a creature whose body is dominant, and the I now is the sensual and animal, and the you is the very easy to demonstrate. I see some doubtful faces, but I'll prove it to you very easily. I'll prove to you that your inner voice of I is all sensual. Imagine you facing something very delicious, especially if you're on diet, and you shouldn't be eating it, and you'd love to taste it. What does your inner voice say? I'd like to taste that. I'd like to taste that. And what does your conscience say? You know you shouldn't. Very humiliating. And usually it's, I'd like to taste that, and the conscience is, excuse me. That's what's become of us. The Gemara says it like this. The Gemara says that the Yetzer Hara is like a passerby in the street. Then he's like a beggar at the door. Then he's like a guest in your home. And then if you're lucky, you remain a guest. We've been hijacked by the lower self. Rabbi Moshe Shapiro put it like this. He said, what's the right way to rob a bank? I mean, you have to imagine him saying this, but what's the right way to rob a bank? You walk in with a motorcycle helmet and a gun. That's not for a Jewish boy. The right way to rob a bank, you make an appointment with the manager, you walk into his office, you lock the door, you put a sock in his mouth, you tie him up, put him in the closet, you sit at his desk, you run the bank. That's the sensible way to rob a bank. That's what's been done to us by the Yetzer Hara. We've been taken over. When you say I, you don't mean I. You mean him. The I is mumbling in a closet with a sock in its mouth someplace. At best. And therefore you find yourself in these two warring motivations. So you can have a very powerful motivation in one direction, a very weak one, but you're able to choose the weaker motivation. I see again dubious faces. Let me prove it to you. But I'm warning you. I'm going to show you an ordeal where a person has a very powerful motivation in one direction and an extremely weak one in another, and I'll show you people choosing the weak option. But your self-defense mechanism is going to say to you, oh, that must have been the stronger appeal. So watch out for that, okay? Are you ready? Okay, ever tried dieting? Oh yeah. Okay. Let me describe a diet to you. I'm going to describe to you a weak motivation and a strong motivation. On the one hand, you have your motivation to diet. Very powerful. Me, my image, getting married maybe, next summer on the Frum Beach, like me. Would you agree that's a powerful motivation? Would you? Okay. On the other hand, you've got this little chocolate-filled wedge thing with a bit of cream and a cherry. Like, that's nothing. You're talking about 10 seconds of pleasure during which you'll feel like an idiot. Again, let's get it clear. On the one hand, you have you, yourself, your image, your future. On the other hand, you have a little nothing. And a minute later, you're looking at a plate that's licked clean. It's like, what happened? Don't tell me that chocolate's a stronger motivation. You have to be out of your head for that. The proof is 1 second after you've done it, you say, what have I done? I'm not talking about people who rationalize. They look at the chocolate and they say, you know how depressed you are. And then you say, and I won't eat it all tomorrow. And yeah, by the time you finished, it's a mitzvah. But it's not like that. You know yourself, the one is trivial, absolutely trivial. And the other one is massive, and you choose the weak. How do people do that? It's easy. Let me give an example that I saw once. I can't think of a strong example, but you have to do your own. I was once an intern, junior intern in a surgical ward. And we had a patient with Berger's disease. This is not that uncommon genetic disease. People who have this are exquisitely sensitive to the nicotine in cigarette smoke. And what happens is when they smoke, their blood vessels close down. So first their fingers fall off, then their hands fall off. Okay? There's not one recorded case in a non-smoker. And if they stop smoking, the disease is arrested. And if they carry on smoking, the disease progresses. That's 100% clear. This man was a 45-year-old, highly intelligent engineer, and he had a blue leg. Because the artery supplying his leg was closing down. And his leg was going blue. And he knew that if he carried on smoking, we have to amputate his leg. Okay? The man carried on smoking, we cut his leg off above the knee. The next time I saw him was a year later. I was an intern. He was being wheeled down the hospital corridor in a wheelchair with no legs, smoking on his way to losing an arm. Oh, how does a person do that? By the way, when I mentioned this recently here at a medical conference, one of the doctors came over and told me that he has a friend who's a vascular surgeon who had a patient like this, that when he lost his second arm, he had his friend rig up a piece of wire on the wheelchair so he could carry on smoking. So let's just understand that man stands there with a cigarette and a leg. And he says to himself, well, on the one hand, throw away the cigarette and live. Live? Leg? Man, father, husband, walk, leg? Or 30 seconds of pleasure during which you'll feel the cold hand of death? But how could you get that wrong? Don't tell me the cigarette's a strong attraction. You have to be raving to say that. And that's us. That's what we do. So Dessler says, and maybe we'll finish with this, and this is not an explanation, but it's a very beautiful description. The explanation is within, of course. There are no clumsy words to say it. The explanation is because you choose. That's who you are. That's the only place where you exist. But he has a very beautiful description. He says something like this. The power of Bechira means you sit here, and above this glass ceiling, the essence of your choice sits. And the options in an ordeal make their presentation to you. First, the one makes its presentation and you fantasize about it. And you push it away. Then the other option makes its presentation. You think about that. And you push it away. It can take a long time. And the symptoms of this battle of Bechira are paralysis. And finally, you open the gate to one of them, and it matters not which one. When you open the gate to the one that you choose, it gets in, and that's all you are. Because this place is unitary. Just like Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. That is everything that you are. If you have an explosive with a fuse, it doesn't matter if you light the fuse with a small match or a flamethrower. It doesn't matter if it's strong or weak. When you ignite it, the point of origin, that's all you are. Which one ignites it? Which one do you open it to? Imagine, here's a description. Imagine you go swimming where the water is very cold. Do you have beaches like that someplace here? In the States, yeah? In South Africa, there's one beach which is ridiculously cold. Painfully cold. So you walk down to the thing, you put your foot in, 2 toes fall off. You know that feeling. He says, it's ridiculous, I'm just getting out of here. But you look back, all your friends are watching you. You came a long way for this swim, so you kind of sidle until one ankle cracks. You keep going till a kneecap disintegrates. Eventually, you find yourself in the water, like up to here. Then there's no going slow after that, right? No going slow. So you say to yourself, just going to go under that water. And then you say, just getting out of here. You see, the symptoms of that battle are, you don't go up and down, up and down. You stand there while each side makes its appeal. The one side says, just go down, you probably won't die. The other side says, just get out of here. And sooner or later, you just go down. And people commit suicide that way. Because you open the gate to the one that you choose. It doesn't matter whether it's strong or weak. Which one is strong and which one is weak is not up to you. But when you find yourself poised at that moment of choice, there's nothing else but your choice. And you make the choice. So you open it to the ridiculous non-life option, or you open it to the life option. That's up to you. And therefore we need to hold very strong here, because we live in a society that says it's really not your fault. It's your Rabbi's fault, it's your mother's fault, it's your grandmother's fault, it's the movies, it's the TV, it's the social influences, your genes, your chemistry. No. All of that stuff is relevant. That pitches you at a point of freedom. But what you choose at that point of freedom, that's up to you. Okay, we'll stop here for today.